4 brothers, 4 songs, 4 number ones, their first 4 singles, ever. Nobody has done that before, nobody has done it since. But the price they paid for it, almost nobody knows. Welcome to EchoLore, the channel where we go beyond the music and into the stories the world forgot to tell. If you love uncovering the real history behind the songs and artists that shaped generations, this is exactly the place for you. So hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Because what happened to this family changed music forever. And it starts right now. In the winter of 1969, a 5-year-old boy stood in front of a microphone at Motown Records and did something no child should have been able to do. He made grown men stop what they were doing. Producers who had heard every voice Detroit had to offer, soul singers, gospel prodigies, seasoned professionals twice his age, went quiet. Because the sound coming out of that small body didn't belong to a child. It carried ache, it carried longing, it carried something that took most singers a lifetime of heartbreak to find. His name was Michael Jackson, and in less than 12 months, he and his 4 brothers would do something that had never been done before and has never been repeated since. 4 songs, 4 number ones. Their first 4 singles ever released, every single one of them climbing straight to the top of the charts. No group in the history of American music had ever opened their career that way. None have since. But here is the part almost nobody talks about. The same father who drilled his sons into perfection was the reason some of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to forgive him. And the group that seemed to arrive out of nowhere, fully formed, an overnight miracle, had actually been grinding in the dark for years before anyone outside Gary, Indiana, ever knew their name. So how does a story that starts with this much light end in so much shadow? How do 5 brothers go from sharing a single microphone in a living room to barely speaking to each other decades later? This is the story of the Jackson 5. Not the version printed on record sleeves, but the one that happened in the small, cramped house where it all began. Before the fame. To understand the Jackson 5, you first have to understand Gary, Indiana, in the 1950s, a city built entirely around one thing: steel. The mills ran day and night, breathing fire into the sky, and everyone who lived there understood the unspoken deal. You worked the furnace, you came home exhausted, and if you were lucky, your children would have a slightly easier life than you did. Joseph Jackson had made peace with that deal. He worked as a crane operator at Inland Steel, hauling molten metal through heat that could blister skin from 30 feet away. It was brutal, unforgiving work, and it left something in him, a hardness that would later shape his sons in ways both extraordinary and devastating. But Joe hadn't always planned on steel. As a younger man, he'd played guitar in a local R&B group called the Falcons, chasing a music career that never quite took off. That dream didn't die. It just went dormant, waiting, quietly, for a second chance. He found it in his own living room. Katherine Jackson, Joe's wife, filled that same small house with something entirely different from the mill's violence: music as comfort. She sang gospel hymns while doing housework. She played country records. She hummed melodies while her children, eventually 9 of them, filled every corner of a house that was never quite big enough. It was Tito, one of the middle sons, who lit the fuse. As the story goes, he and his brothers used to sneak into Joe's bedroom and quietly borrow his prized guitar, the one thing in the house he treated like something sacred. One day, Joe came home to find a broken string. He was furious until he heard Tito play. Because Tito wasn't just fumbling with the instrument, he was actually good. Something shifted in Joe that day. The dream he'd buried under years, the hierarchy of the group quietly, permanently changed. What followed was not a fairy tale, it was labor. Joe Jackson ran rehearsals with a discipline that bordered on military. Hours after school, hours on weekends, hours that other children spent playing outside. If a step was out of sync, if a note was flat, there were consequences. Consequences that decades later, several of the brothers would describe not as tough love, but as fear. Michael would later say that those years cost him something no amount of fame could return: a childhood. While other kids were riding bikes and playing games in the summer heat of Gary, he was rehearsing until his legs ached, memorizing choreography, singing until his young voice was raw. But the brutal irony is this, that unforgiving discipline is also what made them undeniable. By the time they were performing in local clubs, talent shows, and the Chitlin circuit, the network of black-owned venues across the segregated South and Midwest where black performers built their craft. The Jackson 5 weren't just good for kids. They were better than most adults. They opened for legends. They absorbed everything: the smooth choreography of the Temptations, the raw power of James Brown, the vocal architecture of soul and gospel greats who came through those same rooms. Michael, still barely old enough for elementary school, stood in the wings and studied every one of them. Like a scholar preparing for an exam, he refused to fail. They won amateur nights. They built a local reputation. And slowly, unmistakably, word began to spread beyond Gary, Indiana. But talent alone rarely opens doors in the music industry. What the Jackson 5 needed next was a champion. Someone powerful enough to put them in front of the only company that could turn a regional sensation into a national phenomenon. That company was Motown. And getting there would require a leap most families would have found too risky to take. The breakthrough. By 1968, the Jackson 5 had already been rejected once, by Motown itself, at a lower-level audition that didn't see what was coming. It's a detail that rarely makes the highlight reel, but it matters. Before the miracle, there was a door slammed shut. Undeterred, Joe Jackson kept pushing. The group signed briefly with a smaller label, Steeltown Records, releasing a single called Big Boy that gave them just enough of a regional buzz to keep the dream alive. But nowhere near the scale Joe knew his sons deserved. Then came the moment that would be mythologized for generations. A showcase in front of Motown's inner circle, arranged through connections the family had built performing alongside established acts like Gladys Knight and Bobby Taylor, both of whom had separately urged the label to take a serious look at these kids from Gary. The story the world was told was cinematic, that Diana Ross herself discovered the Jackson 5, personally introducing them to the world. It made for an unforgettable narrative, and Motown, ever the master of image-making, embraced it fully. The truth was more complicated, and in some ways, more remarkable. Ross didn't discover them. She championed them, using her enormous star power to amplify what Gladys Knight and Bobby Taylor had already set in motion. But myth-making was part of Motown's genius, and the label understood something crucial. A great story sells as powerfully as a great song. What happened next, though, needed no exaggeration. Motown founder Berry Gordy watched the audition footage and saw something he rarely saw twice in one career: a group of children performing with the polish, the instinct, and the sheer command of seasoned professionals. He didn't just sign them, he relocated them. The entire family moved from Gary to Los Angeles, uprooting everything they knew, chasing a bet Joe Jackson was certain would pay off. Motown assembled a specialized production team behind the group, writers and producers who would later be credited under the collective name The Corporation, and got to work crafting a debut that had to be perfect. Gordy wasn't interested in a good first single. He wanted a phenomenon. He got one. I Want You Back was built with obsessive precision. That unmistakable bass line, those cascading piano chords, and Michael's voice, impossibly assured for an 11-year-old, delivering lines about heartbreak he'd never actually experienced.
Oh, baby, give me one more chance.
It shouldn't have worked. A child singing convincingly about lost love should have felt hollow. Instead, it felt like the most honest thing on the radio. Released in the fall of 1969, The single detonated. It shot to #1 on the pop charts, and just like that, the Jackson 5 weren't a promising new group anymore. They were a sensation. And Motown, sensing lightning in a bottle, moved fast, releasing ABC just months later. Then, The Love You Save. Then, I'll Be There, a ballad so emotionally mature it seemed to belong to a completely different artist than the one who'd been bouncing through ABC a few months earlier. All four went to #1. No act in American music history, not Elvis, not the Beatles, had ever opened a career with 4 consecutive chart-topping singles. Motown had engineered something unprecedented, and America couldn't look away. But somewhere in that whirlwind of studio sessions, television appearances, and screaming fans, something quieter was happening. The boys who had learned discipline through fear back in Gary now had the entire world watching their every move, and the pressure that came with it was only just beginning. The peak. By 1970, the Jackson 5 weren't just a musical act. They were a cultural event. Their television debut on The Ed Sullivan Show introduced them to millions of American households in a single night. Teenage girls who had grown up idolizing the Beatles now pinned Jackson 5 posters to their bedroom walls instead. Merchandise exploded. Lunchboxes, board games, a Saturday morning cartoon that turned the 5 brothers into animated superheroes for a generation of kids who couldn't get enough of them. And at the very center of it all stood Michael, a child not yet a teenager, carrying the weight of the group's magnetism on shoulders that hadn't finished growing. Interviews from this era show something striking if you watch closely. Michael, asked question after question by adult journalists, answers with a poise that feels almost otherworldly. And yet, in unscripted moments, you catch glimpses of a boy who still wanted to play, still wanted normalcy, still flinched at the enormity of what was happening around him. The touring schedule was relentless. Arenas packed wall to wall, girls fainting in the aisles, security struggling to hold back crowds that seemed to multiply at every stop. The brothers were making extraordinary money, figures that would have seemed impossible back in that cramped house in Gary. And yet very little of it, by design, ever passed directly through their own hands. Joe managed the finances. Joe managed the schedule. Joe managed everything. For a while, that arrangement seemed to work because the results were undeniable. Awards piled up. Radio dominance continued. Motown had transformed 5 brothers from a steel town into arguably the biggest young act on the planet. But fame at that altitude comes with a particular kind of danger, because there's nowhere to go from the top except somewhere else. And beneath the surface of platinum records and sold-out arenas, cracks were already beginning to form in places most fans couldn't see.
Welcome back, Carter. Now you can fake it like you reach it.
Michael's voice, the very instrument that had made I'll Be There so devastating, was changing the way every adolescent boy's voice eventually does. What had once been an angelic, impossibly mature child's tone was shifting into something new, something the label would need to figure out how to market all over again. Motown, meanwhile, had already begun shifting its resources and attention. Solo material was carved out for Michael, testing what he could do outside the group. It was billed as expansion. To some of his brothers, it felt like something else entirely, the first quiet signal that the family unit they'd built together might not stay together forever. And behind closed doors, a different kind of tension was building, a battle not over talent, but over money, credit, and control. It was a fight that had been simmering since the earliest Motown contracts were signed, and by the mid-1970s, it could no longer be ignored. The fall. Here is where the story most fans never learn the full truth about. By 1975, the Jackson 5 had grown up, no longer the wide-eyed kids from Gary, but young men with opinions, with creative ambitions, and with a hard-earned understanding of exactly how much money their music had generated for everyone except, they felt, themselves. They wanted to write their own songs. Motown, protective of its hit-making formula, largely refused. They wanted greater creative control. Motown, built on a factory-style system that had made stars out of dozens of acts using the same centralized songwriting team, wasn't built to bend that way. The frustration reached a breaking point, and the brothers made a decision that shocked the industry. They left Motown for Epic Records, chasing the creative freedom the label they'd built their name on refused to give them. But leaving came at a devastating cost neither the group nor their fans fully anticipated.
Reach out my hand to you.
Motown owned the name. The Jackson 5 wasn't just a nickname. It was legally, permanently the property of the label they were walking away from. The brothers would have to rebrand entirely, moving forward under a new name: the Jacksons. And in an even more painful twist, Jermaine, married to Berry Gordy's daughter Hazel, chose to stay behind at Motown, splitting from his own brothers at the exact moment they needed unity most. His younger brother Randy stepped in to fill the gap, but the wound of that separation didn't heal quickly, and for Jermaine, the ripple effects would last for years. The Jacksons pressed forward on Epic, achieving real success. Enjoy Yourself, Shake Your Body, Down to the Ground, proving they could still make hits without the Motown machine behind them. But something had irreversibly shifted. The group that had once operated as a single, unstoppable unit now operated more like 5 talented individuals, occasionally choosing to work together. And at the center of it all, Michael's own trajectory had begun pulling him somewhere the group couldn't follow. In 1979, he released Off the Wall, an album that didn't just succeed, it redefined what a former child star could become as an adult artist. It was sophisticated, danceable, emotionally rich in a way that made his earlier Jackson 5 material feel, in retrospect, like a warm-up act for what was coming. 3 years later came Thriller, an album that didn't just top charts. It rewrote the ceiling of what commercial music could achieve, becoming the best-selling album in history. Michael Jackson was no longer the lead singer of a family group. He was, unmistakably, the most famous musical artist on the planet. And there was no version of the Jacksons that could contain that gravity anymore. The brothers would reunite periodically. The Victory Tour in 1984 stands as one of the group's final, defining moments together. A massive, complicated, often fraught undertaking that drew record crowds, even as tensions between the brothers and their father simmered beneath the surface. But it was, in many ways, a farewell tour disguised as a reunion. Beyond the industry politics and business disputes, there was something even harder to reconcile: the long shadow Joe Jackson's parenting had cast over all of them. In interviews across the following decades, several of the brothers, and later Michael himself, spoke about the discipline of their childhood, not with gratitude, but with real pain. Accounts of physical punishment during rehearsals surfaced repeatedly over the years, details that recontextualized every joyful performance from their early Motown years with a far more uncomfortable truth running underneath it. The family that had given the world so much joy had paid for it in ways the cameras never captured. By the mid-1980s, the Jackson 5, or the Jacksons as they'd become, existed less as an active group and more as a memory the world kept returning to, a chapter that had technically ended without anyone quite marking the date. Legacy. So where did they all end up? Michael, of course, became the most scrutinized, most beloved, and most tragic figure in modern music history, his solo career eclipsing nearly everything that came before it, his personal life becoming a story unto itself, one that ended in 2009 with a death that shocked the entire world and left an unfinished sentence where a legacy should have been complete. Jermaine continued recording and performing, eventually reconciling with his brothers enough to rejoin them for select reunions over the years, the wound from 1975 fading but never fully disappearing. Jackie, Tito, Marlon, and Randy each carved out their own paths, some staying closer to the music industry than others, all of them forever tied to a name that made them famous before most of them were old enough to fully understand what fame meant. In 1997, the Jackson 5 were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a formal acknowledgement of something fans had known for decades. That 4 consecutive #1 debut singles wasn't a fluke, wasn't a marketing trick. It was one of the most extraordinary opening statements any group has ever made in the history of recorded music. Their influence runs deeper than nostalgia. Every boy band that followed, every young vocal group that had to learn choreography, harmony, and stage presence before they'd even finished puberty, owes something to the blueprint Motown built around 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana. The template of the polished all-ages pop group with a breakout lead singer traces directly back to what happened in that recording studio in 1969. But maybe the most important part of this story isn't the charts, or the awards, or even the influence. It's the reminder that behind every joyful record, every song that makes you feel nostalgic for a summer you can't fully remember, there are real people who paid a real cost to make it. The same rehearsals that produced perfect harmonies also stole away childhoods. The same father whose discipline built superstars also left wounds his sons carried for the rest of their lives. The same fame that made them immortal also, eventually, pulled them apart. The Jackson 5 gave the world an impossible gift, 4 #1 singles, before they'd even had the chance to become who they were going to be. And in return, the world gave them very little privacy to figure out who that person actually was. Maybe that's the real lesson buried inside this story. The songs that make us happiest were sometimes born from rooms we'd never want to have stood in ourselves. And maybe understanding that doesn't ruin the music. Maybe it just makes us listen a little more closely. If stories like these remind you why music has the power to shape generations, and why the people behind our favorite songs deserve to be remembered as more than just names on a record label, subscribe to EchoLore and join us as we uncover the forgotten stories behind the artists who changed music forever.